Hello, welcome to the Oxford German Classic podcast. My name is Karolina Wątroba and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in German literature here at Oxford. I coordinate our essay competition for sixth formers called A German Classic, and the aim of this podcast is to encourage you to engage with this year's set text. It is the Verlobung in St Domingo, or the betrothal or the engagement in St Domingo, a short story written by Heinrich von Kleist in 1811. Before I say a bit more about Kleist's story, let me introduce my guest, Dr. Joanna Reisbeck, who is a stipendiary lecturer in German at St Hilda's College, and who was in fact the first coordinator of the Oxford German Classic Prize. So welcome back, Joanna.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. You teach and research 19th century German literature. Can you tell us a bit more about your work at the moment?
Sure. So at the moment, I'm preparing my first book, which is on a romantic poet and philosopher called Caroline von Günderrode, looking at her work through the lens of the reception of the philosophy of Spinoza, who was an important 17th century philosopher, very important for intellectual debates at the end of the 18th century as well. And the reason why I'm doing that is because Günderrode, like many women writers of the period, is often read in biographical terms, and actually I'm trying to say, no, she really was thinking through philosophical problems in her literary work in very interesting ways. And I also do a little bit of work on sort of Goethe, Hölderlin and Novalis as well, well-known writers from the turn of the 19th century.
Wonderful. Your work on Günderrode sounds really fascinating. And today we will actually also talk about philosophy a little bit. I will talk to Joanna about Kleist's use of literature as a vehicle to think through philosophical problems. Before we say more about Die Verlobung in St Domingo specifically, could you tell us what were some of Kleist's philosophical interests more generally?
More generally, yes. So if you're ever looking at Kleist, the first thing you might come across in philosophical terms is his engagement with Kant, often called in scholarship his Kant crisis. Now, who's Kant, you may ask? Well, he's one of the most important philosophers of the 18th century, influential still in many ways in philosophical fields. And what interests Kleist in particular is what's called, in technical terms, Kant's epistemology. That is, how do we know things about the world? At the turn of the 19th century, Kleist writes to his fiancée Wilhelmine von Zenger, and he has this crisis moment. It's sort of in hyperbolic language. There's always a question of how seriously we take this. But he essentially says that if we look at the world through green glasses, we can't be sure if the world out there is actually green, say the table might look green to us, or whether it's just a function of the way we see or the way we perceive things. So the problem there is that, for Kleist at least, is that we can't be certain that the reality out there is not completely affected by the way in which we see it, so the manner in which we see it. And for him, this provokes a crisis, because then how can we derive certain truths about the world if they're entirely conditioned, entirely qualified by the way in which we see it? Now, that's actually not quite what Kant says, and that's part of the problem that has been picked up on in scholarship, that Kleist seems to be adopting a position of radical skepticism. For Kant, for example, the problem is, okay, we can't actually know about the way in which we see the world or the way in which we attain knowledge about the world, but that's okay. We just have to presume it's there and accept that there are certain qualifications and subjective elements about the way in which we see the world. But for Kleist, this is a huge problem. It's also a huge problem not because it's a general problem, it also is one, it could vary between individuals as well. And I think that is where we could take this moment in the letters and apply it to the literary texts, particularly Die Verlobung as well, because we've got different ways in which the characters are perceiving or trying to understand the situation. So Kleist is very interested in how we know things and being skeptical about how we know things about the world, and how we can then think about those in sort of real literary situations and real life situations too. I suppose another important element alongside Kant, so Kant is very much considered to be an Enlightenment figure. So the Enlightenment is often synonymous with the 18th century, and there are certain ideas we might associate with that. And that would be the application of reason or rationality in order to encourage human progress. So in a slightly cliched or simplistic reading, Enlightenment provides us with an optimistic view about human society, about human nature, and that we can actually improve things. That becomes a bit complicated around 1789 and the consequences of the French Revolution, because that seems to embody certain Enlightenment values, certain ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity as well. But then the terror happens, and you see all this sort of mob violence in Paris, and that seems to complicate the idea that we can have historical progress. So these ideas about optimism are very much being contested throughout the period, and then really do have quite profound consequences for how Kleist is thinking at the turn of the 19th century.
Yes, he is very firmly embedded in both those historical events happening at the time and the philosophical debates informed by them. So I'd like to ask you now about how those broader philosophical problems are reflected in Die Verlobung in Santo Domingo. But let me set the context a bit first. So the story is set in the Caribbean, in what is today the Republic of Haiti, at the time of the insurrection of self-liberated slaves against French colonial rule that led to the country's independence in 1804. Against this dramatic historical background develops an ill-fated love story between Tony, a mixed-race teenage girl, and Gustav, a white traveler from Europe. And as will be clear from my short summary, the story turns quite violent. So Tony lives with her mother, Babekan, who is also mixed race, and her mother's partner, called Congo Hoango, who is black. And he is currently away with the other revolutionaries. Gustav arrives at Tony's house seeking shelter. Tony initially agrees to help Babekan lure Gustav into their home, pretending that he is safe there, and then let him be killed by Congo Hoango. But then she falls in love with Gustav, who proposes to her, and Tony tries to deceive Babekan and Congo Hoango and save Gustav, but through a series of dramatic turns of events and fatal miscommunication, Gustav comes to believe that Tony has betrayed him and kills her. But then when he learns his mistake, he commits suicide. So what philosophical problems do we see reflected in Die Verlobung in Santo Domingo?
That's an extremely good question. I think I'd probably stopped off with connecting it with politics in some way or other, because there is an explicit section in the text where we have the reference to the French Revolution and the terror with Gustav's tale of Mariana. So there's a clear parallel being drawn then between what happened after the French Revolution and the events in Haiti as well. And this is pretty common in the period. So what's going on in the text is really this question of freedom is being worked out. And particularly freedom when it's conceived of as anarchic as well as arbitrary violence. We have to be careful, actually, when we read Die Verlobung in St Domingo, particularly to do with the narrator as well. The narrator is biased and might lead us to believe then that the Black uprising is unjustified. But what's interesting too is the way in which the text frames this idea of humanity as something that's potentially problematic, that's being worked out between the characters. The idea of Menschlichkeit or menschlich pops up a lot, and a very important moment between Tony and Gustav when they have an emotional moment, and then there's a very interesting moment by the narrator who's gently hinting that they're coming together and they're having sex. If I can say this.
We discussed it in
We discussed this in the other bit. That's very. But the idea is then that there's a sort of, so there are two things that are going on. There's a concern about freedom in this anarchic way in which it's enacted then by Congo Humango. There is also a question about, well, what constitutes humanity as well? And the humanity itself has to be worked through or achieved by the characters. This is not a given. And that humanity then seems to be located in moments of successful communication between the characters. So what these are really moral questions as well as political questions that are being worked through in the text.
Yes. And we have both described this extreme situation in which the characters find themselves, which throws up all of those questions about freedom and humanity and those big concepts that they have to work through. And in fact, many of Kleist's stories and plays portray people in extreme circumstances. So what are some other examples of this beyond Die Verlobung in Santo Domingo? What are some other typical Kleistian scenarios of extremity?
Well, yes, that is a very good way to describe what Kleist does. I think the most obvious comparison would be with the earthquake in Chile, das Erdbeben in Chile, which is quite explicitly working through a problem called theodicy. So this idea that if we live in the best of all possible worlds, that's an idea derived from Leibniz in the early 18th century, then how can a just God allow evil things to happen? And the earthquake then in Chile, which was a historical event, is then being explicitly linked to debates from the 1750s when most of Lisbon was destroyed in an earthquake. So that's the opening of the text, is then this earthquake that destroys all, the judiciary, the church, the government then of Santiago. And then there's a question also, what happens after this? What happens when you destroy when a society is destroyed in this arbitrary manner? And it's a text that then moves through a brief idyllic moment where there seems to be a harmony in society, but then the two protagonists are scapegoated. They are the ones who are considered to be responsible for the earthquake. So it's a text that's very much interested in how people try to make sense of events that are inexplicable, and then how religion and moral authority is used and misused and is actually then a catalyst for horrific violence. So we see a pattern then of these philosophical problems being then entwined with quite extreme moments of human behavior. I suppose another example to move away from the theodicy question would be Die Marquise von O, which is also interested in knowledge. It's a novella that opens with a newspaper advertisement that's been put out by the Marquess of O, because she wants to find out who the father of her child is. Now, you might think, okay, that's a very strange thing to want to find out. And that's the sort of one of the cruxes of the text, is how does she not know what happened to her? It's a text that's very much interested in sexual behavior and how sexual behavior might be socially unacceptable. It turns out that she's the victim of a rape of some sort by a Russian count. What's also strange about the text is how the Marquess herself cannot reconcile the idea of this count. She first thinks he's a hero, she then faints, and then that's where the rape happens. And when she finds out that actually he's the person to have assaulted her, to have impregnated her, she cannot believe it. And that's a very interesting moment in the text, not least because the way in which Kleist's narrative stance often works is that he gives us the external aspects of the characters. He gives us their actions, their behaviors, not necessarily always psychological insight. So that's what makes that text very interesting. And if I have time also, the one more example would probably be Penthesilea, too, which is interested in communication and knowledge, and that's a very psychological text. But we can come on to that when we're thinking about why Kleist is interested in such extreme scenarios.
Yeah, we can certainly come back to Penthesilea. In fact, why don't we pose this question that you just suggested straight away? Yes, because it is key. So why was Kleist so drawn to those extreme scenarios, do you think?
That's a very good question. I can't absolutely account for it, nor would I wish to. But I think we can say a couple of things. For his short stories, for his novellas, there seems to be a general structuring principle of them, which is to do with this idea, and I'm going to quote in German then switch to English, of an unerhörte Begebenheit, some sort of unprecedented or shocking event that happens. So we have that with the Marquise von O, the Marquess of O, with this idea of not knowing who the father of the child is. We have that then in the earthquake in Chile with the earthquake itself. And then we have it as well, I suppose, in Die Verlobung in St Domingo by the situation, but also with this mixed race love story as well. So Kleist seems to be interested in placing characters in situations and almost seeing how they react to this scenario that they have to think their way through it, and it's so unusual that itself becomes the main point of fascination for the reader of these texts, is how do you work out this sort of impossible scenario in Die Marquise von U. And I think for his plays, well, that's probably a little bit different then. With Penthesilea in particular, I think what he's doing is not so much working through the narrative structure of the novella form, as it comes to be important in German, so much as responding to Goethe and Schiller and their ideas of classicism. So classicism for Goethe, to give one example of Iphigenia auf Tauris, Iphigenia on Tauris, is a play where we have characters who are psychologically damaged, the sort of the Tantalids, so they've had all sorts of awful things happen to them. And essentially the play is about how do you avert disaster repeating itself? And the way in which this seems to occur throughout the play is essentially promoting an idea of humanism, of humane discourse, of humane conversation with one another, to finding a way to resolve conflict without it falling into tragedy. And Penthesilea is a play that goes in quite the opposite direction. It's very much interested in the horrific moments of human violence. So the scheme is then Penthesilea and Achilles are set up as potential lovers from different tribes during the siege of Troy. And the problem is that they both have a certain ethic of domination, that one cannot submit to the other. They have to dominate the other. That's an impossible conflict. And the way in which it becomes resolved in the play is that Achilles presents himself on the battlefield to Penthesilea, feigns, as it were, submission to her, and she is in such an extraordinary rage that she tears him apart, limb from limb with her hounds. And there's this most extraordinary speech that goes through this event. And that itself is a very extreme response to Goethe and doing something very different from that form of classicism. So Kleist is then interesting because he is so provocative as well. It was a controversial play at the time. So that would be a sort of slightly convoluted answer to your question, that there are different reasons as to why Kleist seems so drawn to these unusual and extreme scenarios.
So from what you're saying, it also sounds like Kleist is not only engaged in those philosophical debates, but also in the literary tradition of portraying certain situation or certain motifs. So why is he so interested in literary form and the possibility of literature to tackle those philosophical problems? What is it about literature that makes it such a useful, unique tool for Kleist to explore those extreme scenarios and complexities?
I think, oh gosh, that's an incredibly good question. Difficult to answer it in a comprehensive way. What I would say is that Kleist is very much interested in what language can do. Anyway, there is sort of a lot of work that he does on how language and thought interact. That's on the one hand. I think he is exploiting his use of German is quite legalistic. So you get these quite complicated sentences where you never really know where you're going to end up. So what Kleist rewards is very, very attentive reading for that reason. And in terms of how literature and philosophy interact, I can answer that more generally, which is that any writer in this period around the turn of the 19th century is going to be engaged in philosophical debates. There is a clear intersection between the two. So that would be a general point. Potentially a more specific point about Kleist per se is probably returning to this point before about, well, what does literature allow you to do that philosophy doesn't? And it's a different form of argumentation. There's a different logic to literature than there is to, say, a philosophical text or a philosophical dialogue. And Kleist is then sort of almost colliding certain philosophical ideas with the various situations that we see throughout the novellas as well. And I think what we have to be careful here is not saying, well, is literature simply a working out of a philosophical idea? That would be reducing it in some way to simply being a sort of a subsidiary of philosophy. It's not that. It's a way in which it gets integrated, and the way in which we never actually have any final answers, which I think is important. That Kleist then exploits literary form and language in order to open up moments of ambiguity, where we're not really sure quite what is going on, or quite how to read certain moments. I'm thinking in particular of the end of Das Erdbeben in Chile, where there's a very famous final line, where the character says to himself, it was almost as if he had to be glad. I'm translating it on the fly here, but there's a subjunctive there that sort of creates this open-endedness of, well, this could be a happy ending, but it's not. So it's a sort of ways in which he's playing with form that can be irritating to us as readers, but that is itself provocative. And philosophy can't quite do that in the same way. The use of language is, of course, different. So that's probably where Kleist becomes interesting for us.
Yes, and we certainly want to encourage the sixth formers who would like to take part in the competition to dwell in those moments of productive ambiguity and really explore how exactly it happens in this story by Kleist. So thank you, Joanna, for talking to us about Kleist's use of literature as a vehicle for thinking through philosophical problems and much more, as we've established. And for those of you listening, have a look at our website or just search for Oxford German Classic Prize to find out more about our essay competition for sixth formers. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a lot. Do have a look at other episodes of this podcast too. But for now, bye-bye and tschüss.